It has been 12 years since the original Dark Souls release, and other studios have been attempting to emulate it ever since. Yet, I think we are about to experience the most polished Souls-like to date. At the Summer Game Fest earlier this week, Lies of P, an intriguing Souls-like from the Korean studio NEOWIZ, not only revealed its final release date, but also delivered a fully playable demo on PC and consoles, alongside its newest trailer. I've played through the entire impressively long demo of about 3 to 4 hours, explored pretty much every mechanic, found the cheese for one of the bosses, and overall, came out of it impressed. Hey, I'm Catalystz. I've been speedrunning FromSoftware games for close to 6 years and spent over 7,000 hours on them. Yet, all of the Souls-likes that I've played so far have done very little to impress me. So when I say that Lies of P should be on your radar, it is quite high praise. In Lies of P you play as Pinocchio in a reimagined story taking place in a setting inspired by late 19th century France, where steampunk levels are set to 100. Ever since the original reveal, it has drawn comparisons to Bloodborne, and the inspiration is clear. However, the demo did not at all feel like Bloodborne, which is only a good thing as that would be a high bar to clear. The visual style of the game is outstanding, it looks great, and runs really good on PC as well. Some people had issues with fan speeds when playing on unlimited FPS, but overall, it was an extremely smooth demo, which in this day and age, unfortunately, counts as a huge plus. The demo showcased a good variety of enemies and bosses, each with fairly unique weapons and movesets, so if the rest of the game keeps this up, it seems like a really good execution of the setting, which on paper could be seen as quite limiting, when you're mostly fighting puppets and humans. The story of Lies of P is obviously based on the fable of Pinocchio, and on paper appears fairly simple. A city of Krat was prospering due to the use of automated puppets. Think robots of all kinds, but these went rogue. We don't know exactly what happened, and that is part of what we as players will be discovering. The protagonist Pinocchio is of course a puppet himself, but on a higher level than the enemies we encounter. He's much more human-like with the ability to lie, which the other puppets are not supposed to have. The entire lying mechanic should play into the story as well, giving players the opportunity to decide how to respond in certain situations, which may determine the outcome of questlines and potentially change endings. On his quest to become human, Pinocchio is accompanied by the caged cricket puppet Gemini. The atmosphere of the game is dark, and you can tell that horror has descended on the city, though not knowing exactly what happened leaves players curious. There will be questlines connected to NPCs who you talk to, but it seems like they are giving you some hints of where to go, as you can see these character icons on the fast travel menu at certain areas. This is short of giving you a quest log, but it can make questlines more accessible. That said, if the quests are not cryptic and fairly obvious as the side quest in the demo, it may be unnecessary. We'll have to wait and see. Throughout the game, you also find little pieces of newspapers or something like an attraction guidebook that tells you backstory of certain landmarks. It's definitely fairly FromSoftware-like storytelling, but it felt more explicit, which I, to be honest, enjoyed. Let's get to the fundamental part of any Souls-inspired game, combat. I would describe it as a mixture of mechanics from several FromSoftware games, combined in a pretty original fashion. Other Souls-likes try to copy all kinds of stuff, without really thinking about it too much, but the team at NEOWIZ seems to have really understood what each mechanic's purpose is, and carried them over pretty successfully. That being said, it is not without its issues. The basic combat is fairly standard. Just like in Bloodborne, you get a roll without being locked onto an enemy, and a short dash with invincibility when locked on. However, you can also block. Blocking reduces damage taken, but gives you the ability to regain some health back with a feature similar to the rally system from Bloodborne, where attacking an enemy after taking damage allows you to regain portion of the lost health. Getting hit again though depletes this rally health, and you cannot regain anything. That can be quite punishing. Enemies have a similar system as well, where they will start regaining health when you don't attack them for a while, so the game's really trying to push you to play aggressive. Another point for this is that if you run out of healing items, you'll be recharging the pulse cell, as this game's Estus Flask is called, with attacking, so you're incentivized to use them a lot and then recover the charges during combat. Besides a regular block, there's also an addition of a Sekiro-style parry. A perfect block works just like in Sekiro, where you press block just as you're about to be hit by an enemy, which completely negates any damage taken, while also building up the enemy's stagger bar, and on some enemies also damages their weapon, which can then break completely. Furthermore, there are some attacks of enemies where they turn red, and these attacks cannot be dodged or guarded. They can only be perfectly parried or strafed. However, unlike in Sekiro, you cannot see the poise bar of your enemies, so the benefits of perfect guard are not as obvious, but I'll talk about that later. So just for the basic combat, you have a combination of dashing and rolling, guarding with its rally system, and perfect parries as well. What may sometimes counteract the aggressive playstyle is how little stamina is drained while sprinting. You can basically sprint as much as you want in this game, so potentially you could just bait out attacks that you know how to punish and avoid attacks you find difficult. On the other hand, this is understandable, because without sprinting, the overall move speed is somewhat sluggish and pretty slow for my standard. That being said, the combat felt satisfying and swift, reactive without any weird delays. There was good feedback when hitting enemies and when being hit. Nevertheless, there were also some issues. The biggest problem is without a doubt getting stuck on enemies when trying to dash to their side. This was happening quite regularly and felt frustrating, because you're expecting the game to do one thing and your character to be in a specific position, but something else completely occurs. The dash itself has a shorter range that scales with equip load, and so you're thinking about parrying instead. However, the game didn't seem to communicate well what benefits there are to parrying. It just felt like a perfect parry was a way to avoid punishment, that is damage, rather than also getting some kind of a benefit. In general, parrying can be pretty difficult because you're fighting puppets with very snappy movements, plenty of delayed attacks, or attacks with weird pacing. It seems like the stagger build-up from perfect parries also depends on what weapon you're using, which I guess is fair, that a lighter and faster weapon would promote a playstyle of dodging around more and poking with counterattacks rather than stabbing still and parrying, but with the dash feeling a bit off and the parry thus having higher value, it seems pretty bad to force players into specific weapon types to gain the maximum benefits of the parry. Also, you achieve a stagger by building up enough poise damage to put the enemy into a so-called groggy state, during which a heavy attack, that is an R2, will fully stagger them and then allow you to perform a fatal attack, which is just another name for a riposte or a visceral attack. Those sometimes feel a bit over the top, but again, the feedback is good and it fits the style of the game well. Outside of basic combat, you also have mana, called Fable. You build this up by attacking enemies, further assisting the rewards of being aggressive. Each weapon and handle of a weapon, which I'll explain in a second what that means, has its own art, so you have two active at the same time. There are offensive, defensive, and utility-based Fable arts, each costing a unique amount of Fable. It is a decent system overall, however this particular Fable art, where you parry an enemy and get a counterattack, was super terrible. It has a long wind up and it's awful to time. It just didn't feel good to use at all. Most likely, this one needs to get rid of the wind up so that timing it is just a lot more intuitive. Besides Fable arts, you have something like the prosthetic upgrades from Sekiro as well, where your robotic arm can get different attachments, each doing something else. In the demo, we had just a standard arm that can be used to punch for heavier damage. Then there was a grapple, allowing to grapple enemies towards you. You cannot aim it up or down that much, which made it feel a little bit awkward. At the end of the demo, you also become Iron Man with an electric blast. You'll be able to upgrade these gadgets later on, which is going to increase their utility rather than simply increasing damage, so they might be quite interesting. They have their own mana bar, and you can refill that with consumables, or it also refills out of combat. All in all, not a bad addition to your arsenal. You can switch them around at Stargazers, this game's version of bonfires. This covers combat. Let's now move on to some other mechanics. So unsurprisingly, there are different weapon types in the game. Right at the start, you choose from a fast, balanced, or heavy playstyle. It's kind of like a starting class. You basically get a weapon and a set of stats to accompany that weapon. These weapons have different movesets, different weight, different scaling, kind of standard stuff. But all of the weapons in the demo felt pretty unique. It seems like NEOWIZ are rather going for Bloodborne than Souls style, where there will be less weapons, but each is gonna be a lot more unique. Speaking of unique, this was the most interesting part for me, the different weapon handles. Essentially, most weapons can be disassembled into a blade and the handle. The handle determines the Fable art, the moveset and the scaling, while the blade determines the attack values and is also what you upgrade. That means you don't necessarily worry about committing to one weapon or weapon type, because you can keep the upgraded blade and assign it to a different handle. It seems like a really good system to be able not just to try different playstyles, but also to swap out Fable arts that you do not like. However, when trying to do that, I ran into an issue which I'll mention in the boss section in a bit. Besides regular blade upgrades, you can also change the material of a handle, which will then determine its scaling. It uses a special kind of material that was unavailable in the demo, and any changes can also be reverted back. It's kind of like enchanting in Souls, I suppose. Definitely increases the customization for your build, where maybe a handle with a Fable art that you like wouldn't scale with your current stats. Well, that issue can be solved. At the very end of the demo, we also get a sneak peek for another customization option. And well, they could have chosen a better name for this. The P-Organ. The P-Organ is essentially Pinocchio's core, which can be upgraded. You have several phases of upgrades. In the demo, we can only see the first. There are multiple nodes per phase, and putting upgrades into each node can unlock the node's special bonus. There are a number of different types of upgrades. Offensive, defensive, item, and ability types. All of them are obtained by using quartz, a material that we can find. Some of these upgrades can, for example, enhance dashing, so maybe they can fix some of the issues I have with the specific core fundamental mechanics. Like in the case of the rally system, where you can regain health after blocking, right? You get it back very slowly and require many attacks. Well, there's an upgrade for that will make it quicker. For consumables, besides your healing item, you also have the typical ones like greases to apply to weapons, or typical throwables which deal fire or lightning damage, or something like an exploding bullet. Pretty typical stuff. A welcome addition is the inclusion of the pouch from Elden Ring, which allows you to quickly access a larger selection of items. Another mechanic in regards to weapons that I didn't really understand was weapon durability. So your weapons can break pretty fast, and when they do, you deal little damage and bounce off enemies. The way to repair them is using your arm in the form of an item that you hold. Or there's also a consumable which can repair them instantly for the context of combat, I suppose. But I don't really get why this mechanic is in the game. There's nothing to be gained, it seems, from keeping your weapon repaired. You're only suffering when they break. To look at Dark Souls, durability was a big thing in Dark Souls 2, but there it had a purpose, and I could understand why it was there. It was forcing the player to keep several weapons on hand and ready to use, which the game facilitated by giving them plenty of upgrade materials. So the fundamental goal of the weapon durability was to force the player to use a selection of different weapons. Here, besides serving as a way to show a cool animation off, I don't see the purpose at all. As for leveling Pinocchio, it's kind of what you would expect. There are equivalents to vitality or vigor. In fact, this game actually has both of them. Dexterity, strength, endurance, and stuff like Arcane. It's a bit more minimalistic in the style of Bloodborne rather than Souls. One thing I would appreciate is icons at the resistance values for each particular resistance. There already are some when there's a status buildup as you get hit by that particular element, so this would help in orientation. Honestly, I would expect them to add this in the final game. You level up using Ergo, which are the game's form of souls. There's an interesting mechanic in regards to this. You lose Ergo on death, just like in a typical Souls game, but if you lose them inside of a boss battle, you can in fact pick them up right before the fog gate, which is a change that I feel sort of indifferent about. I guess it's nice to be able to recover and spend Ergo you might have lost after an unexpected boss encounter. Interestingly, part of that Ergo is also any build-up Fable, so you can get into a boss battle, build up your Fable, die, and then if you had it full, you can pick up your Ergo and start the next fight with full Fable. At the final boss, there was also a summon mechanic, but lore-wise, it wasn't explained very well. It wasn't like a regular NPC, just some random specter who would attack the boss. Very standard stuff, but seemed to be there just for the sake of being there and copying a mechanic expected of a Souls game. So with combat and the adjacent mechanics covered, let's look at the level design. There are areas that you would typically expect in a city. Streets, a train station, rooftops, a hotel that also serves as the main hub with NPCs, town squares, bridges. Nothing extremely memorable, but I did appreciate a surprising level of verticality, where you often run above areas that you will go to or that you had already been in. Overall though, it felt very linear. There was a very clear progression from the start of the demo to the end. There was basically just one area where the streets on the ground connected a little bit more, and after unlocking some locked gates wrapped around to previous areas, but it felt more like a Devil May Cry game or the old God of War games rather than Souls. I think my biggest problem with the design was that besides just being very linear, the game isn't super creative when it comes to managing boundaries. They feel very video game-like and unnatural. Besides, there are many invisible walls that kind of limit your freedom. To be honest, this goes hand in hand with the pathetic jump the game has. You jump by pressing L3 while sprinting, but the distance is minimal. It also looks really wacky, kind of like the falling animation. All the other animations look pretty polished, but these are just out of place. Another limiting thing was the inability to drop down from a ladder. The collision around it would just not let me pass, even though you could fall from all kinds of ledges around the rooftops. To summarize, the areas look nice, but they certainly feel like a video game and lack immersion. And because the game has to hold you inbounds way too much, it also repeats a lot of the objects it uses to do so. Chariots, luggage, some dead animals, and so on. A big part of any Souls-like are the bosses, but I want to talk about the AI first. Now, in most cases, it definitely didn't feel broken, but there were several instances where the enemies just kind of ignored me, or the pathfinding wouldn't really work properly, and there was one case where I managed to break it a lot. There were 3 bosses in the demo, and all of them felt pretty distinct from each other. 2 were big puppet creations, and 1 was a human enemy. I would say the general difficulty felt kind of high, but that might be simply because I was getting used to the game's systems. On the first boss, I didn't really block at all, I just used dashing. While on the last boss, it felt a lot more like playing Sekiro. Meanwhile, the Mad Donkey, well, I managed to cheese the crap out of him. Basically on this bridge, there's a cutscene and then the fight begins. The transition overall is quite nice, but I think they forgot to put a fog wall in the arena or something and just let me run backwards. The enemy also had no aggro distance. First, I did manage to de-aggro him by entering an elevator shortcut. The boss wouldn't follow me there, but I somehow got him to not re-aggro and instead get stuck in this doorway where I was able to repeatedly hit him. Then, when he aggroed again, I managed to keep him aggroed even when entering the elevator all of a sudden. This allowed me to exit the area and keep the boss fight active even when going super far away. In the end, since the boss couldn't enter the elevator, I managed to just tap him one attack at a time until he died. Funnily enough, when the fight was done, we were teleported straight to the bridge. It was pretty hilarious. Then I ran into another problem with the last boss. I thought he was really well done. Good mix of attacks, some elemental attacks, basically a two-phase boss with one health bar. But right before him, I decided to switch to a different handle just to try out something new. And also to get rid of the garbage parry fable art. The only downgrade was supposed to be scaling in my main technique stat going from B to C. Can't be too bad, right? Since I'm keeping my upgraded blade anyways. Well, all of a sudden, I was doing very little damage per hit. And my new moveset was also much slower. I struggled against the boss because it was just way too long. I even had to repair my weapon twice during it. After switching back to my previous handle, just look at the difference. On the second try with the old handle, I just obliterated the boss. This is also where I felt like going for a lot of perfect guards felt very satisfying in gameplay, but didn't feel like it was giving me enough of a benefit. I don't know what happened with the handle, and perhaps the enchantment system where you change the scaling of a particular handle would remedy this issue, but it felt very unintuitive to just lose so much damage out of nowhere. For the sound design of the game, it all felt pretty nice, especially the last boss had a banging soundtrack, and it all seemed to fit the theme of the game well. Attacks and killing enemies have a good auditory response, which feels satisfying, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Except, unfortunately, they did not keep the Mad Donkey voice acting from the Gamescom demo.
You cunning rascal, you won't get through here, die.
Besides the aforementioned more major issues that I have observed, there are also some smaller annoyances that could nevertheless be pretty easily fixed until the full release. The camera feels quite floaty. It carries certain momentum with it, which makes it seem like it doesn't really respond to the player's command as well. However, while this was very noticeable at the start, by the end of the demo, I was used to it a lot more. Another thing is that once you open your inventory, it is impossible to completely exit out of it using the start button. Instead, it is necessary to press B or circle several times to get back to gameplay. You open up your menu quite a lot in games like these to change equipment and check consumables and stuff like that, so it would be nice to be able to exit out of it quickly. Another annoying thing with the menu is that it doesn't wrap around vertically. Like if I open the menu and want to navigate to the pouch quickly, it doesn't allow me to press up on the D-pad. I have to scroll through the entire menu. I also mentioned the icons for stats, which could make it much easier to recognize what benefits you're getting with new gear or new levels. A slightly confusing thing is also that you usually change your arm at a Stargazer, right? But that is not the case in the hub area, where you have to go to a dedicated working table, and the game never really mentions that. Another minor but pretty annoying thing is that pop-ups for various items that you find for the first time show up on screen, but they disappear way too fast to actually read all of the text accompanying them. The prompt just disappeared, I was reading that, dog! This means I start reading something, it disappears, and I have to open up my inventory, find the item, and read what it is again. A lot of the dialogue also doesn't really flow smoothly from one line to another, unless you're advancing it manually. There are big delays between individual parts if you just sit and observe.
Welcome.
Some characters' mouths keep moving when they're not speaking as well, which is kind of funny. Overall though, these are minor problems and can be easily solved for release, or they won't really detract that much from the core experience. Anyways, to summarize my thoughts, the dash is such a core integral part of the experience that getting it wrong would normally break a game. However, Lies of P brings forth so many systems, such as the parry, that it still works even when the dash is a little off. That being said, especially getting stuck on enemies is really bad and truly needs to be fixed for the full release. Otherwise, it's just gonna be a source of frustration. As I said at the beginning, I'm not easily impressed by Souls-likes. I don't think there has been a single one that I could say I truly enjoyed. When I was done with the demo of Lies of P, however, I wanted to play more. The combat was fun, even with its quirks, especially the last boss felt very satisfying to learn the patterns of, and the mystique of the story left me curious. I do wonder if the world is going to open up a little bit more, or if it's gonna continue in such a linear path. I think that could run its course over the span of the entire game. But the demo felt polished, the movement was maybe a bit sluggish at times due to the slower run speed, but overall there were no glaring issues as most other clones of FromSoftware games have. I will say that I was looking forward to playing more, and I definitely didn't dislike the game, which is pretty high praise.
Nice landing, but let's not make it a habit.
I recommend you to keep Lies of P on your watch list for the full release on September 19th, and to try out the demo if you haven't already. If you have, what did you think? Do you agree with my assessment? Or do you think I was too harsh? Or maybe not harsh enough? I would love to hear your thoughts. But until then, thank you for watching, and as always, have a great day. Nice. Amazing.